I'm sorry, I should have said, looks like everyone's here and that we're ready to go live. Court can now officially go on the record and we'll be in session here. We can let Dr. Thornton into the courtroom. Dr. Thornton, can you hear me okay this morning?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, I can hear you as well, although I'll admit it was a little faint there. But are you ready to resume your testimony this morning?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, great. Then Ms. Riggs, you may ask your next question of this witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Thornton. Thank you for making time to be with us again today. Throughout your report, you cite to an affidavit from Brian Neesby in 2015. Isn't that correct?
I do cite to his affidavit, yes.
And it was submitted in 2015 in relation to the case challenging House Bill 589. Isn't that right?
I believe so.
And in that affidavit, Mr. Neesby is offering critiques of an analysis performed by Dr. Stewart, correct?
Yes,
And Dr. Stewart is not an expert in this case, correct?
that is correct.
Mr. Neesby's affidavit does not analyze the work of Professor Quinn in this case, correct?
That's correct.
In your report, you write, Professor Quinn's sensitivity analysis is also inaccurate because he fails to account for the difference in the rate at which African American registered voters may have military ID. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Dr. Thornton, are you aware that legislative defendants submitted a report from another expert in this case named Dr. Keegan Callanan?
No,
So you are unaware that Dr. Callanan argued that in North Carolina, 0.8% of African Americans are active duty service members as compared to 1.2% of non-Hispanic whites.
I don't know what the statistics are.
Okay. Do you have any reason sitting here today to dispute Dr. Callanan's statistics on that front?
I don't know one way or another. I don't know what his foundation is for his calculations, so.
Okay, and you didn't consider the evidence offered by legislative defendants from Dr. Callanan in your report, is that right?
No, I independently looked at the question.
Oh. Okay. And walk with me through a hypothetical. Assuming Dr. Callanan is correct that 0.8% of African Americans are active duty service members and 1.2% of non-Hispanic whites are active duty service members, that would mean that white North Carolinians are 50% more likely to be active duty service members. Isn't that right?
Based on your arithmetic. But that doesn't, address the question that I am answering.
According to Dr. Callanan, 1.2 is 50% more than 0.8. Isn't that correct?
1.2 and 0.8. Arithmetically, it's a difference of 0.4 percentage points.
Right.
So it's about a third. The 1.2% is it's a third higher than the 0.8%.
1.2 divided by 0.8 is 1.5. Isn't that right?
Yes, and I know that you are using these 1.5 and 2 times types of calculations, and it's just not a descriptive that I typically would use.
I understand, but I'm just trying to establish some basic numbers that according to legislative defendants' own experts, white voters in North Carolina are 1.5 times or 50% more likely to be service members than Black voters. And you don't disagree with me on that math, correct?
It's arithmetic.
Okay. So turning to page 30 of your report, and Ashley, we can put that up. It's JX 800 at 30. You write that at the top of the page, according to North Carolina demography, 21% of veterans in North Carolina are African American. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you don't report the percentage of North Carolina veterans that are white, do you?
No, I'm looking at the gap. I'm looking at the percentage among African Americans, because my baseline is the percentage African American among registered voters is 20.65%. So in my comparisons, that's what I'm looking at.
And if I represent to you that Professor Callanan reported that non-Hispanic whites comprised 73% of veterans as of 2019, when they comprised 64% of registered voters in North Carolina, would you have any reason to dispute that?
I don't know one way or another.
So white North Carolinians are more likely to be veterans than Black North Carolinians, according to legislative defendants' own expert. Isn't that correct?
Yes, but what is the comparison I'm making is 21% higher than the 20.65%. Because if the 21%,
I'm sorry, Dr. Thornton, I could not hear your numbers. You said, what is the comparison I'm making is, and I heard something. I don't know what it was.
is if because 21% is higher than 20.65%. That's the differential that I'm looking at.
But you didn't report in your report that white veterans are overrepresented in North Carolina compared to their voter registration numbers, correct?
No, because as I said, I'm looking at to see if there's overrepresentation among African Americans, because to the extent there is, then with those additional IDs, what I'm looking at is, would it reduce the percentage that Dr. Quinn calculates as the 7.61% that he calculates among African American registered voters without an ID as he's measured it. That's the question I'm answering.
And you don't think the far larger overrepresentation of white veterans is relevant to the question of racial disparities in ID possessions?
I think the more important question is the percent African American, because of the distribution among the no matches. The question then becomes, would it bring down that gap from the 7.61 percentage points? Because it's getting closer and closer to zero. So would it bring it closer to zero?
But you didn't provide the court data on the effect that white voters holding veterans IDs would have on the overall rate of no matches in North Carolina. Isn't that true?
I did not report that. As I've testified, I've provided my reasoning for what I did provide.
Ashley, can you put up Dr. Thornton's report JX 800 at table 2? Thank you. Dr. Thornton, on direct exam in your report, you testified that in your opinion, the racial disparity between Black and white voters on the no match list decreased from Dr. Quinn's analysis in 2015 compared to his analysis in this case. Isn't that right?
not sure why you said 2015. If the question was that the gap has been reduced in 2020 as compared to 2015, then the answer is yes.
And looking at table 2, one of the differences between Dr. Quinn's work in 2015 and in his report in this case in 2020 was that he had access to federal ID possession data, including data on passports, military ID, and veterans ID in that report, correct?
He did have that information. And even so, without that information, the sheer numbers of African Americans who he estimates without an ID has been reduced, even without those data.
In his report, he discusses that in the 2015 analysis, the federal IDs added 184,205 matches. Isn't that right?
He may have, I don't recall.
Okay, can we pull up JX5 at page 17, paragraph 49? Okay, does this refresh your recollection?
Yes, I've read it.
Okay, so we have 158,683 voters added with a passport, 18,597 added with a military ID, and 6,925 added with a veterans ID. Is that correct?
Yes, and keeping in mind, as I testified yesterday, it's additive. So he starts with passports, then he goes to the, as I recall, military and then veterans ID. So if he had flipped it, it's possible military ID are also amongst the passports and also amongst the veterans IDs. So consequently, it's more accurate to say in total he has this number, but the distribution is based on how he ordered it.
Right, and we just discussed that according to legislative defendants' own testimony, or own expert, that white voters in North Carolina are more likely to possess veterans and military IDs, correct?
That's what you stated.
And Dr. Quinn testified on direct and indicated in his report that he had evidence that white voters were more likely to possess passports, correct?
Well, but going back to his testimony, it was based on a study of 146 individuals sampled within North Carolina. And so you have a pretty high margin of error, and those data should not be applied to at the state level.
Assuming the court disagrees with you, one would expect then if these forms of federal ID were added to his matching analysis in this case, they would generate new matches, but also increase the racial disparity in favor of white voters. Isn't that true?
I don't believe we know the answer to that question because the military IDs could very well be have the opposite effect because we know that Cumberland County has a disproportionate number of no matches and is disproportionately African American among those no matches. There are 35% African American among those matches. So I don't believe that one can make that conclusion.
Right, Dr. Thornton, but assuming your fellow expert on behalf of legislative defendants is correct, and that white voters in North Carolina are more likely to hold active military IDs and veterans IDs, and assuming the court credits Dr. Quinn's testimony that white voters are more likely to have passports,
That's right. You accidentally muted yourself. You said in veterans IDs and assuming the court credits Dr. Quinn's testimony.
that white voters are more likely to have passports, the addition of federal IDs would exacerbate the racial disparity.
Now you're speculating. Based on the data that I reviewed, I don't believe that one can come to that conclusion.
I'm having my computer is wanting to mute itself a lot. Dr. Thornton, I'm not speculating. I'm asking you a hypothetical, which I am entitled to do. If legislative defendants expert, Mr. Callanan, Dr. Callanan is correct, and Dr. Quinn are correct, that the 3 federal IDs, passports, military IDs, and veterans IDs, are disproportionately held by white voters, the addition of federal IDs, which we were not given access to in this case, would in fact exacerbate the racial disparities. Isn't that true?
Objection. This has been asked and answered a couple times, Your Honors.
It has, Your
Even
Honors.
if the objection's overruled, you may answer the question.
It is your hypothetical. Again, it's speculation. We do not know amongst the no matches how it would have an influence. The question is, among the no matches, how will these additional forms of ID influence the outcome? That's a different question from the statistics that you're identifying. That if one looks at the military IDs, I don't believe that is an accurate assessment. But it's, the court may have a different opinion on that, as your hypothetical is alluding to. And so, other than saying it's a hypothetical, how it's been interpreted, I don't know. But we're looking at it as the no matches, and based on the information we have, I don't believe one can make the hypothetical that you're providing.
Dr. Thornton, I still don't have an answer to my question. I have provided you a hypothetical. In this case of the hypothetical, the addition of additional IDs in which white voters are overrepresented would exacerbate the racial disparity seen, correct? Yes or no?
Again, objection, Your Honor. She just answered this question.
Overruled.
If you are providing me a hypothetical, and if your hypothetical is that the overwhelming majority of all of these would be white, then that would be the case. My question is, it's a hypothetical, and we're talking about is reality. And so I don't know quite how much more I can answer the question. It's a hypothetical. If your hypothetical happens to be true, then yes. But we don't know the answer to what the reality is, because the no matches are from a different distribution than the matches.
Thank you for answering my question, Dr. Thornton. Can we go back to table 2 in JX 800?
Ms. Riggs, I'm going to interject here for just a second because I'm still having a hard time hearing Dr. Thornton. Her voice is very choppy. I don't know if it's choppy for you, but it is for me. And I know it's choppy for the court reporter. And I suspect that she's having a hard time taking this down. It's important that the record be complete. It's important that the record be full, and that obviously she's not able to make a full and complete record if she's not able to hear folks. So the reason I interject is, if you've got 5-10 more minutes of questions, then we probably would go forward in the manner that we're going forward right now. But if you say that you have another 30 minutes or an hour of questions, which is fine if you do, I'm going to suggest that perhaps Dr. Thornton call in, and maybe she can mute her computer and then call in on the phone. I don't know, but I want to do some kind of workaround so that her voice is not choppy anymore. I'm frustrated with it, and I suspect others are too, because I'm making out what she's saying, but frankly, it's kind of hard to make out what she's saying on almost every single answer. So I don't know how that hits you. I don't know how if you want to respond to that, but if this is going to be another good while, which is fine if it is, then I'm thinking that we need to do some kind of workaround. So do you want to address that?
Your Honor, I think I only have a handful more questions, a few more minutes, and I'll keep trying to mute myself when not speaking.
Okay, well then let's go forward then and try to make it through it as best we can. We've been at it with this witness for a while, and I probably should have done something a long time ago. I was hoping it got better. It would get better, and it frankly never has. But anyway.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Thornton, looking at your table 2 and comparing the number of white voters on the no match list from 2015 to the number of white voters on the no match list in 2020, it's not likely that there were 50,000 new white voters who joined the rolls and don't have photo ID. Isn't that correct?
I don't know one way or another.
Okay. So you don't think that's likely related to the unavailability of federal ID data? Is that your testimony?
I just don't know.
And if the white number of no matches goes down with the predicted effect of the addition of federal IDs, the disparity percentage of black voters on the no match list goes up, doesn't it?
Yes, and then the opposite would be true if the number of African American no matches went down.
Right, but it's a zero-sum game on percentages, right? If the white no matches increase, that percentage goes down and other percentages have to go up, correct?
Yes, and in your example, if only one group went down, I mean, it depends on the total distribution.
You're not aware, pursuant to changes to list maintenance procedures and the use of confirmation mailings that must be returned by voters, that North Carolina removed 575,000 voters in its January 2019 list maintenance activities, are you?
I don't know of any others.
You weren't aware about the 575,000 being removed. Isn't that correct?
I may have read that or somewhere recently.
Safe to assume then that you don't know the racial demographics of those 575,000 voters removed, correct?
That's correct. If I look at the no matches among the inactive voters, it could be disproportionately Black among the no matches.
Dr. Thornton, sitting here today, you cannot and have not named one single one of the 113,575 Black voters that Dr. Quinn identified on his no match list to be on his no match list who actually possess an ID compliant with Senate Bill 824. Isn't that true?
They're on the no match list. So we've identified some portion that may very well have an ID. But as the purpose of my report was to identify the shortcomings of Dr. Quinn's matching analysis and to look at the racial composition of the IDs that he didn't include, including local government IDs.
Right, and my question was, sitting here today, Dr. Thornton, notwithstanding what you were asked to do, you cannot identify a single one of the 113,570 Black voters that Dr. Quinn identified as lacking SB 824 compliant ID. Yes or no?
I did not identify them specifically.
And additionally, in your report, you have not identified a single voter at all on Professor Quinn's entire no match list who you can state with certainty should not be on that no match list, correct?
I haven't stated it specifically. Have I identified them? Yes. I've given examples of matches that where individuals do appear to have an ID. Did I name them specifically? No,
You didn't provide that in your report, correct?
that's correct. Nor did Dr. Quinn list out all the no matches or matches.
Dr. Thornton, thank you for your time today. I have no further questions for you at this time.
All right, Mr. Cox, do you have questions of this witness?
I do not, Your Honor. Thank you.
Mr. Patterson, do you have redirect questions for this witness?
I do have some questions, Your Honor.
All right, you may proceed.
Good morning, Dr. Thornton. It's good to see you again this morning.
Good morning.
You were asked on cross about the title on the slides that we prepared with the orange and gray shading. Do you recall that?
Yes,
And those questions only went to the precision of the title on the slides that you testified about. Is that right?
that's correct.
Did that series of questions affect your opinion on the extent to which the orange and gray shading in Dr. Quinn's exhibits accurately conveyed his results?
No,
I would like to bring up LX 260, and we've redone those slides. So that's the first page is Dr. Quinn's. If we go to the next one, now we have titled this slide, in the 2016 election, the difference in qualifying ID possession between registered white voters at 98.46% and registered Black voters at 96.86% was 1.6%. Does this title more precisely convey what is displayed on this slide?
yes,
If we could go to the next page, please. And this is, we've similarly reworded the title for the 2018 election. Does this also more precisely convey what is shown on this slide?
yes,
Okay, great. We can take that down now. On cross, you were asked questions about the effect on adding the additional agency and school IDs to SB 824. Do you recall that?
yes.
I'd like to bring up Professor Quinn's report, JX5 at 36, and this is table 6. And so this is where Dr. Quinn reports how many additional matches are attributable to each ID type he had. Is that right?
That's correct.
And while Dr. Quinn elsewhere in his report reports the racial breakdown of the SBE issued IDs, he nowhere reports the racial breakdown of the agency and school IDs, does he?
No, he does not.
So he doesn't report how those affected the racial disparity that he found, correct?
That is correct.
Now on cross, you were asked questions about false positives. Do you recall that?
That's correct.
Did Professor Quinn do a manual review of false positives?
No, he did not.
But you agree with Professor Quinn that based on the uniqueness of his matching fields, the number of false positives likely will be small. Is that right?
That is correct.
Based on the matching techniques Professor Quinn used, is it your opinion that the likely number of false negatives in his analysis will be large compared to the likely number of false positives?
Yes,
I'd like to bring up your report now, JX 800, and go to page 15. Let's scroll down to the heading there, that heading 4. So you were asked extensively about this sentence. Dr. Quinn does not consider or take into account the requirement of county boards of elections to issue without charge voter photo identification cards upon the request of the registered voters. Can you explain why your statement there is not misleading in the context in which it is used?
yes. The context of what I am stating is that it's in reference to early voting. That's what the statement is in reference to, and that the early voting, if the law had not been enjoined, would have given registered voters the opportunity of obtaining a free voter ID card. That's the context of that sentence. And it was then looking at within that section about the racial composition of those who utilize early voting. That's the context of that sentence.
Now, to your knowledge, have the free IDs under SB 824 ever been available during early voting in North Carolina?
Not to my knowledge.
So looking at the past issuance of free IDs during the period of time before SB 824 was enjoined is not the same as the analysis you're speaking about in this paragraph. Is that right?
That is correct.
Now, you testified that it is your understanding that not all early voting sites are required to provide free ID. To your knowledge, is there anything prohibiting county boards issuing free IDs at all early voting sites?
Not to my knowledge.
And you were also asked about the issuance of free ID during the 2018 election, if I recall, but SB 824 had not been enacted at that time, correct?
That's correct.
So free IDs were not available at any early voting sites in 2018, correct?
That is correct.
I'd like to bring up PDX 6-2. So this was a slide you were shown on cross titled BVAP percentage for counties without satellite one-stop voting sites. If a county only offered early voting at the county board of elections and not at a satellite one-stop site, wouldn't that mean that all early voters in those counties would be able to obtain free ID when voting early at the county board of elections?
That is correct.
Okay, and now I would like to go to PDX 6-3. So, and this was a demonstrative showing Dr. Quinn's composite matching fields. Do you recall being asked about those?
Yes,
Now, if a voter is missing both driver's license number and SSN4, that voter would have to match on either last name or SoundX last name to be a match using Dr. Quinn's fields, correct?
that is correct.
So if there is a spelling variation in last name across databases that is not accounted for by SoundX, it would be impossible for a person missing driver's license number and SSN4 to match, correct?
That is correct.
Is that a potential source of false negatives in Dr. Quinn's analysis?
Yes,
And a voter missing driver's license number and SSN4 in the voter file in all but one instance would also have to match on first name, correct?
that is correct.
Is that also a potential source of false negatives in Dr. Quinn's analysis?
Yes, it is.
In your opinion, are voters missing driver's license number and SSN4 more likely to be false negatives in Professor Quinn's analysis than voters with those fields populated?
Yes,
Objection leading.
yes. If you have a driver's license
Excuse
number,
me, just
driver's-
Hold on. Dr. Thornton, just allow the court to rule on that objection.
the objection's overruled. You may answer the question. Sorry. When there's an objection, if you want to, just pause long enough for me to rule on it, it'd be great.
I apologize, Your Honor. If the driver's license number is populated, then that's a simple match. It matches by driver's license. Once you're looking at these other fields, then you're going to be more likely to have error.
And if the driver's license number and the social security number are missing, that means that there's less data for those voters to match on, correct?
Yes,
If additional fields did not reduce the likelihood of no matches, would there have been any reason for Dr. Quinn to have used them in his analysis?
no,
Isn't it the case that the reason multiple fields are used in these types of matching analyses is to account for the possibility that missing or inaccurate data may preclude a match on any particular string?
that's correct. For example, if we had driver's license number populated, well, then that would be a simple match, as I testified, or a social security number is there. It makes it easier to match than without those data.
Now, in your opinion, if Dr. Quinn had only used the 4 fields that can match without a driver's license number and SSN4 in his analysis, do you think his no match list would have been larger than the no match list he found?
Yes, and you can actually see it from the data that he provided.
Okay, and why is that?
Because in the data that he provided, he identifies how each of the observations of registered voters matched. And so without those fields of social or driver's license, he would not have necessarily matched. He would not have matched by the other matching fields. So without those fields, they would not have had a match in some instances.
Now I'd like to go to Table 8 of your report, which is, again, JX 800. Okay, and you were asked about this table and the fact that you don't report the number of white voters that are missing driver's license number and SSN4. Do you recall those questions?
Yes.
Now, although you don't report the number of white voters, if we look, for example, at the snapshot of registered voters missing the last 4 digits of SSN, overall, it's 7.27%. And for African Americans, it's 9.25%, which is higher than 7.27. Given that whites make up a majority of the voter file, to what extent is it likely, if any, that whites would be at or beneath 7.27% in that data?
Well, whites or other demographic groups would have to have a lower percentage for the overall to be 7.27% as compared to the higher percentage among African Americans of 9.25%. So something needs to be lower.
And the same is true for these other data you report in this table. Is that right?
That is correct.
Let's now turn down to paragraph 56. Okay, in this paragraph, and you were asked about this on cross, about the 240,185 people on the no match list that matched to a driver's license in the DMV data. Do you recall those questions?
Yes,
Now, you're not claiming that all of these 240,000 plus individuals have a qualifying ID currently, are you?
no, I'm not.
And what is the claim that you're making with respect to these individuals?
I'm identifying that at some point, these individuals were able to obtain an ID through the DMV. And it is possible that some of them are valid. I've identified some that are, but we do not know the entirety of the valid, how many are valid, because we do not have all of the DMV data to tell us that, because we only have one issuance. What I am stating is that they have shown in the past that they were able to obtain an acceptable ID and may be able to obtain an acceptable ID in the future. That's what I state.
Great, thanks for clarifying that. Now, you were asked on cross about your reliance on an affidavit by Brian Neesby. Do you recall those questions?
Yes.
Why did you rely on the Neesby affidavit if he was speaking to a 2015 matching exercise?
For several reasons. One is Brian Neesby is the chief data officer, and he does have a very good understanding, obviously, of the Board of Education data, Board of Elections data, as well as the DMV data. In 2015, the no matches that he was looking at of Dr. Stewart, as Dr. Quinn stated at the time, were very similar to those that he used at that time, and they used similar matching algorithms. And the relevance of Mr. Neesby's affidavit is that he identifies specific DMV tables that he found influenced the no matches of Dr. Stewart at that time. And it's the same kind of matching that we have here. The relevance of those tables is still very much present for this matching exercise.
And Dr. Quinn also did not use those tables, is that right?
That's correct.
Now, on cross, you were asked about statistics on ID possession by military members and veterans. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Now, to know how the presence of these additional IDs would affect Dr. Quinn's findings, you would need to know how many individuals possess those IDs and are also no matches in Quinn's analysis, correct?
That is correct.
And we simply do not have any data on that. Is that right?
No, other than we can see in the among the no matches, there are some military addresses.
And
But beyond that, we don't know.
And the statistics that plaintiff's counsel asked you to accept for purposes of a hypothesis on cross do not speak to that question, correct?
That is correct.
Now, on cross, you were also asked about the 184,205 voters added by federal IDs in the Curry litigation. Do you recall that?
Yes.
In the Curry litigation, Dr. Quinn did not report whether these 184,205 additional matches widened or narrowed the racial disparity in ID possession that he found, did he?
He did not.
So there's no basis to say whether the addition of those types of IDs in that case or in this case would widen or narrow the racial disparity based on Dr. Quinn's findings. Is that correct?
Objection leading.
Objection is overruled. You may answer the question.
What we know is that the distribution of the no matches is different, as I testified earlier. Therefore, the influence of those additional forms of ID is not known.
Now, Dr. Thornton, in this case, you were asked to critique Dr. Quinn's analysis and not conduct your own beginning to end matching analysis. Is that right?
That is correct.
And on direct, you testified that in your opinion, Dr. Quinn has not established a racial disparity in qualifying voter ID possession by registered voters under SB 824. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And in your opinion, is the information in your report and testimony fully supportive of that opinion?
Yes, it is.
And was anything you were asked on cross affect that opinion?
No.
Thank you, Dr. Thornton. I have no additional questions.
Ms. Riggs, do you have any other recross?
Just a couple, Your Honor. I'm sorry. If we could bring up Table 8 in JX 800. Dr. Thornton, this table lists percentages of voters missing SSN or driver's license, correct?
It lists the percentage for each and then one or the other.
We can't derive from this the number of records missing both Social Security and driver's license, correct?
No, I did not calculate that.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. You can take that down. Dr. Thornton, you testified that it is your opinion that in Dr. Quinn's matching analysis, there are more likely to be false negatives than false positives. Did I understand you correctly?
Yes, based on the uniqueness of his matches.
You did not quantify the expected rates of false positives anywhere in your report, correct?
No, nor did Dr. Quinn.
You did not quantify the expected rate of false negatives anywhere in your report, did you?
No, my report identifies shortcomings among the no matches.
And so the answer to that was correct.
The answer is, if you're asking me if I reported it, no, I did not report it.
Okay, and you did not quantify how either false positive or false negatives may affect the racial disparity in qualifying ID possession, correct?
No, nor did Dr. Quinn.
I have no further questions. Thank you, Dr. Thornton.
Mr. Cox, do you have any questions?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Patterson, do you have any other questions?
No, Your Honor.
All right, there may be some questions from the court. So I'll turn it over to, I think Judge Oakley may have some questions.
Good morning, ma'am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Let me give you a qualifier. I'm going to ask you a few questions about your qualifications, and these are not insulting questions. It's simply because your audio has broken up from time to time, and I wasn't sure that I heard everything that you said. So there were some questions about whether you were a professor or not, and I believe you said that you were not. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And in terms of your qualifications, did you say that you had a bachelor's and a master's?
I have a doctorate. I have a PhD in economics. I have a master's degree in economics. I have a bachelor's degree in economics and political science, Your Honor.
Okay, great. That's the part I didn't hear. I didn't hear the PhD part. So, all right. Well, thank you, Dr. Thornton. I didn't get that when you testified. Now, Dr. Thornton, as you testified to both the attorneys, I believe you were hired to critique and identify the shortcomings in Dr. Quinn's report. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, I just want to orient you to where these questions are going. I'm going to ask you some things about driver's licenses and the things that Mr. Neesby said in his affidavit. So my understanding is that the largest category in Dr. Quinn's report of things that he tried to match to voter registration rolls is the data set that's contained in photographic driver's license identifications from the Department of Motor Vehicles. Is that correct?
Yes, that's the largest source of matches.
Okay. So what is your understanding of what photographic driver's license identifications can be used to vote under Senate Bill 824?
So there are specific IDs that can be used, and off the top, I'd actually need to have the list, but my recollection is, for example, a learner's permit, I do not believe are permissible. But it's more of the permits that are not admissible, but all others, as I recall, are. And there are different forms of permits. But then expired licenses are also allowed, I believe, if they've been expired for 1 year, as well as if the individual is 65 or older and the license was unexpired when they turned 65. That's my recollection. So in terms of the DMV issued IDs, I believe those are in general, the requirements.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. And that's my understanding too. So now going to Mr. Neesby's affidavit that you relied on, it's my understanding from your testimony that that Mr. Neesby in his affidavit identified other files that are kept at the Department of Motor Vehicles that they keep other data. For example, what tickets you've had and suspended licenses and licenses that go back in the past. And by looking at those files, I think your testimony is that by looking at those files, there may be some voters, or no, put it this way, there may be some persons who should actually decrease the number of people in the no match list because those files may reveal that in fact they may have a qualifying ID. Is that correct?
That's correct. In particular, to be more specific, when Dr. Quinn applied his matching criteria, he looked at the expiration date.
Right.
We only have one possible entry for a given driver's license number in what was produced. And there is a history file, and you would think, well, if it's history, then they must be older than what was provided. What Brian Neesby found back in 2015 is that that's not the case. If you go to this historical file, there are actually issuances that would indicate that that driver actually had an unexpired license. But what was produced was a different issuance and expiration date than what was available in the history file.
Okay, great. Thanks. That's exactly what I wanted to ask you about. That's the part, and I'll be honest with you, I don't get it. So let me see if you can explain it to me. So here's my driver's license. And I hope the lawyers will forgive me if I don't mark it as a demonstrative, but it's got a photograph on it and it's got a number on it. So, and my name's pretty unique. So as I understand it, at the DMV, there would be a history file for me. And if you go back in that, if you looked at my history file, you would go back and you would see that every 5 years or whatever the law is, I've renewed my license. And those old licenses are expired. So in my history file, if you looked at it, none of those expired licenses could be used to vote or under 824. So looking at that history file wouldn't reveal any new identification that could be used under 824, correct?
In your example, that's correct.
Right. Now we're going to get to the more complicated one. Okay. So let me just walk you through it. So let's say that I had been a bad boy, which I haven't, and that 15 years ago I got a DWI, and I'll represent to you that under North Carolina criminal law, on your first DWI, if certain qualifications, you can get a limited permit. And then 5 years later, I was a bad person again, and I got a second one, and then my license was revoked for 4 years, but then I got my license back. And then I got a third one, and my license was permanently revoked. So now I'm a person in the DMV file that does not have a valid license. But if you go back in my history file, you would see those valid licenses in the past, but they've all now been canceled. So looking at my history file in that circumstance would also not reveal any licenses that could be used to vote in 824. Correct?
In that example, that's correct.
Okay, good. Now here's my question. Give me an example of a driver that would have a license in the past. I mean, because here's the part I don't get. Here's my number, it's assigned to me. And if I have a license and a number, presumably under my name, the old ones are going to be under that number and that name. So how is there an additional license in the past that can be used to vote?
And I think that the perhaps the clarification is, while it's referred to as a history file, it's the use of the word history that makes one thinks that it has the old issuances in it. Because there are other issuances that are in that history file that are still unexpired, because an individual may have more than one license. And so it's my understanding.
Let me stop you. That's the part I don't get. What other licenses?
Because in the an individual may have multiple licenses, and so consequently you may, in the file that was produced, it may have and I need to be clear, there are multiple files. So one file just has your a number and an issuance date and an expiration date, essentially. That's about it. It doesn't have in there whether it's the status. Status is in a completely different file. So to know if it's suspended or things of that nature, you're not going to get that from that history file. It will tell you whether it's when it was issued and the expiration date. So for a given individual, he or she may have multiple entries in that driver history file, but only one was pulled for what was produced. And I did a check to see, is there only one unique date associated with the number and what I was produced to Dr. Quinn and me, and that's the case. So I think Brian Neesby, he may have, the way he described it in his affidavit is that while it's called a history, doesn't mean it contains expired licenses.
So when you testified before that that Dr. Quinn had removed, canceled, suspended licenses, and correct me if I'm wrong, it was your testimony that he should not have done that?
What I was testifying about is in whether he should or should not have done that. What I was testifying about is that he removed some of them. And so there's an inconsistency there. Keeping in mind the status, the status file is a completely different file altogether. It has nothing to do with expiration dates.
Okay. But if he removed ones that were canceled or suspended longer than 1 year ago, he'd be attempting to match things that actually were useful for voting under 824, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So the 500,000 number that you had included all canceled and suspended licenses. Is that correct?
Not all.
Not
He
all. Which
included-
ones did you not include in that number?
Oh, what I was doing was identifying, because he included in his footnote, he said he included some.
Right.
What I was quantifying is, well, if I take his algorithm and remove that select he had in the programming logic, what is the change in the number you get? And it's about 500,000.
Okay, but that 500,000 number would include a whole lot of IDs that couldn't be used to vote under 824. Wouldn't that be correct?
It could, and similarly, he would have included some other group of them as well. So I was merely counting how many is he removing.
Okay, okay. I think that may be it. Let me just look here for a second. I made a couple of notes while you testify. Thank you so much, Dr. Thornton. That's it. Thank you so much. I appreciate you being with us.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, give me just 1 second here. All right, do any of the lawyers have questions of Dr. Thornton based upon the questions asked by the court?
None from legislative defendants, Your Honor.
None from the
None
state.
from plaintiffs. Sorry, none from plaintiffs, Your Honor.
Okay, great. Dr. Thornton, thank you so much for being here. Your testimony is now concluded and you're free to leave the virtual courtroom.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. All right. Mr. Thompson, who will be the next witness for the legislative defendants?
Your Honor, the legislative defendants call Brian Neesby to the stand. And Ms. Moss will be handling that direct testimony.
Okay, I know that there's an outstanding motion to exclude portions of Mr. Neesby's testimony.
Your Honor, sorry to interject, but if this needs to be done before the witness is let in, the witness is now in the courtroom.
That's okay.
Okay.
I think it's all right that he's in the courtroom. Thank you. I won't mention anything. Mr. Neesby, can you hear me?
I can just hear you now. I had to switch the device. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear. Thank you, sir. Give me just 1 second here and I'll get right back to you. Who will be handling Mr. Neesby on behalf of the plaintiffs?
I will be. David Giller from the plaintiffs.
And how about for the state defendants?
Your Honors, I'll introduce my colleague Olga Visotskaya de Brito. She will be handling any questioning of Mr. Neesby.
Can you pronounce her last name for me one more time very slowly?
Visotskaya de Brito.
Your Honors, to the extent you will drop De Brito, it's fine with me. Olga Visotskaya is how I go.
Okay, so you're okay if I call you Miss De Brito?
That's fine too.
Okay. Pronounce your last name for me one more time.
It's Visotskaya De Brito. And I usually go by Visotskaya, but De Brito is easier for the court, and that's fine.
No, if you usually go by Visotskaya, then I'll call you Visotskaya. I just hope that I call you Visotskaya correctly. Am I saying it close to right?
You are saying it perfectly.
Visotskaya. I probably need to say it about 10 times off the record to make sure that I get it right, but I'm trying to spell it phonetically so that I won't butcher it. We have a judge on here who also has a name that's hard to pronounce, and it took me a half a year to get his name right. But so welcome, Ms. Visotskaya.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay, so back to the issue at hand with Mr. Neesby. Ms. Moss, since you're handling the witness, let me ask this question to you. I know that the plaintiffs did not object to certain portions of Neesby's testimony. In other words, they didn't object to his testimony in whole, but they did object to certain portions of it. And so my question is, do we need to make a ruling on that pending motion before he begins to testify? Or should we go ahead and hear the unobjected to portions of his testimony and then rule on those other portions later? Just wanting to get your feedback on that, Ms. Moss.
Well, in my view on it, Your Honor, is it's not entirely clear to me which questions they would be objecting to. Our view is all of that, what we're going to be asking is factual information. So I don't, it's hard for me to say I can do one portion of my examination of him and not another, because I think it'll be question by question dependent, perhaps, whether they have an objection or not. So we'll proceed however the court would like, but if you're asking me my view, I think that we should proceed and handle it on a question by question basis.
Mr. Giller, do you want to chime in on this issue?
If needed, we can obviously proceed in a question by question basis. I mean, I think that our motion was very clear that while we're not objecting to all of the testimony, we are objecting to the information contained and that would be elicited coming basically from the affidavit, and especially from that study and critique of Dr. Stewart that appears to be Dr. Quinn. It might be easier to rule on that before, but if the court wants to proceed on a question by question objection basis, the plaintiffs will do whatever the court believes is best.
Okay. Miss Zatskika? I knew I'd mess it up. Do you wish to be heard about that?
Your Honor, I think our position, Mr. Cox shared it with the court yesterday. He will answer questions if the court believe it will guide the court in its determination. And I think that Ms. Moss' proposal that that's a proposal that perhaps it will be handled on a question by question basis makes the most sense to me.
Okay. I'll tell you what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into breakout session here momentarily, and I will get right back to you all as soon as we can, okay?